Well, maybe we might start because we've been talking a lot about works this afternoon that surround us, but maybe not looking so closely at individuals. I wondered if we could sort of start with the works that are in this exhibition, and perhaps David beginning with the magic hour.
Yes.
So could you tell me a little bit more about the process?
Well, one thing to say is that that's not good, is it? When Anna was talking, it made me think, when we were talking about the relationship between the autographic and the mechanical. It's not good. I use a lot of spray paint, and spray paint. I want to talk for spray paint. Because it's very strange stuff. Because it's you don't touch the paper when you're using spray paint, and there's a certain level at which you're completely out of control. And I tend to work on very small paper when I'm using spray paint, because the smaller the paper, the harder it is to control it. Yeah. And there's always a level of, well, you could call it error, but it's there's always a level of randomness and contingency and unpredicted and unanticipated effects, and that's exactly the reason for using it. And then, so part of the work is a response to what happens when you're trying to, when you're spraying a piece of paper and then working on it. But specifically these suite of drawings relate to a large sculpture that I made originally in 2004, and then exhibited at the light show at the Hayward Gallery last year, and which was a very large. I mean, it's about 3 meters high. It wasn't that large. In the company of Richard Deacon, it's not that large. It was a series of dark old light boxes which faced the wall, and they threw the light and the colour onto the wall, so the colour bounced off the wall. So it had a rather dark centre with a kind of halo of colour around it. And the drawings were a way of just reflecting on it when I got back to the studio. There's no drawing involved in making the work itself, because I use found objects and these light boxes and steel structure and such like. But I was looking at it in the show, and I just wanted to think about it a bit more. And drawing is quite a useful way of reflecting on what you've done, as at least as much for me as reflecting on what you're going to do. None of my drawings are made as plans or models for future three-dimensional works. They tend often to look like they're going to be that, but I never realize them. But I did have in mind that I might make another version of this, the Magic Hour sculpture, which was more asymmetric than the one I had in. And it's also about wanting to find out how little colour I could use in a work, and the work still be substantially about colour. Mm-hmm. And so it's how little can you use, and yet the colour still be the most important thing in the work. And of course I include black within that, as well as black as being a way of blotting out colour. So. And
I read, I don't know if this is correct, but I read that the title refers to the magic hour is the moment when the light is fading away. Is that?
Yes, I mean it's a lovely phrase. Yes, it's dusk essentially, and apparently in Las Vegas it's when everyone starts spending their money. It's as the light goes from the light, because Las Vegas in daytime is terrible. It's a horrible place. But as the light goes and the lights of the city, begin to, really to pump out, the volume, then that's the magic hour, and that's when your wallet starts sort of, escaping, and I just find it. It also refers, an interest of mine is the relationship between the colours of nature and the colours of the city. So here we're meant to be talking about abstract drawing. I'm already talking about colour. So
maybe we can come back to that.
Yeah.
But thinking about the light fading, and I guess what you get as you descend into darkness is the loss of visibility, the loss of the object, I guess, in sense. And
yes.
Emma, I've read in an interview with you, you talk about trying to represent things that are perhaps more sensed than seen, things that are perhaps invisible or not, or there was a notion of forces. And I wondered if you can relate that to the work Field 12 that's in this exhibition, or how you might...
Yes. I mean, with my work, I always work in the grey area to immediately be contrary to the field of colour. And for me, and it's a central concern with this whole exhibition around the idea of abstraction being to do with a certain idea of separations between subject and object, and subject and world, where we need to have certain sort of prejudices to generate certain sorts of categories and certain sorts of definitions in order to function effectively and to generate meaning and to be successful, to create terrain where we can successfully function. And the whole idea of the abstract, as Anna was talking about, is this, it immediately sets up certain sorts of problems, the idea of an external reality or something that needs to be withdrawn from. There's a sense of immediately of binaries, of separations, and you know, where then do you find something? Where do you find meaning? Where do you find the truth? Where do you find the fact? And for me, that's always been a very central problem. I mean, I studied philosophy many years ago, and I was interested in trying to break down those sorts of separations. I was interested in philosophers who were trying to feel out something like a middle zone or an in-between space, which is again, I was interested in what Anna was talking about. And for me, the grey area is the in-between space. Mm-hmm. It's the middle place. It's the place that is between the extremes. It's the place where the definitions collapse. It's the place where it's the twilight zone. It's the space of transformation, of becomings. It's the half-light where things begin to merge, where separations become less clear, where definitions become problematic and they stop functioning, and where function itself starts collapsing. So I've always been interested in trying to lever open a space, which is difficult to do because all of our ideas around function and succeeding and being able to talk about things are to do with stable grounds, to try and generate a space where a resilience is and a capacity and a resistance is developed around ambiguity. And that all sorts of things can go on in that space.
And how did this work develop, the work that's here at Field 12?
Well, this again, it's already been, certain things have already come up around mark making. For example, ways of making precise marks. So I am interested in setting up ways of thinking about space, which then, as fast as I'm doing it, I'm dismantling it in order to open up this terrain, keep open this terrain. So in that drawing, I've repeated a rectangle with a template. It's a precision instrument, and yet what I've done is it's gone mad. You know, I have, and listening to sound. I constantly listen to sound when I make work, in order to disrupt to disrupt the geometry, to make it organic. I mean, to actually for it for passage to be unfolded between the geometry, the attempt to master some sort of space and its constant collapse. So the repetition is disintegrating into a noise, you know, and then where those disintegrations occur, a certain sort of material, and also sanding. As fast as I'm doing it, I'm sanding as well, you know, to get the material to erode and to generate, again, this sort of space. And when there's a sort of natural configuration through that sort of dancing over the surface, where there's a natural accumulation of matter, like disintegrated graphite, carbon matter back down again, then I'll do something in that area and for example, bomb it with black carbon, which is unmediated material. It's just bang. It's just a fact. And and then, you know, there's this amorphous chaos about that, which I then try to get under control with something that is suggestive of science and modelling and, you know, cartography. But at every stage, I'm constantly undoing, you know, the spaces I set up.
So it's a drawing that develops through process rather than design, would you say?
Absolutely, yeah. It's all about the relational. It's all about construction and deconstruction. It's all about opening up a space. And it's always about responding and reacting in order to keep open a middle ground rather than for it to fall into anything that's defining, but for it not to collapse into total chaos. So it's this, sort of trying to find a way of building up a resilience and a resistance around lack of mastery and, you know, and keeping open that space for what might present in that sort of space.
Thinking about your work, David, I guess process sometimes occurs within a series, would you say? Or one work might lead to another?
Yeah, I mean, always. In a way, the hardest thing is getting started. But once you have got started, then every work you make, and certainly every drawing you make, tends to propose another one, or at least another 5 often. I mean, you could have done it this way, you could have done it a bit bigger or smaller. So there's always an inevitable sense of remainder that you can just follow up. And I'm distrustful of the sort of the fine ideas I have when I'm trudging to the studio. Things only start working when, in a way, those get abandoned and you get, to some extent, lost in the process of making the work. And the errors, that accumulate and so forth, they're the things that generate possibility and take you away from yourself. I mean, there's quite a bit of talk earlier on about the non-self, and I think making work is not about amplifying your fine ideas. It's much more about jettisoning them, and in a way the work becomes the instructor of you rather than you of it.
I think this is an interesting question again, this whole thing of acquiescence and control. And again, I mean, that's something I was interested in previously when I was studying. My dissertation was on contingency and constraint, where you set up these polarities of submitting this idea of trying to escape constraint so that you fly off into other areas, for example, the transcendent or the spiritual, or into the machine, or into places that somehow you feel that you can abdicate or be free of a certain constraining selfhood, whatever that means. And I've always been interested in trying to find ways of rhythming that difficulty. So I'm constantly trying to find ways of dismantling my own way of going about things, but without flying off into terrain that doesn't belong in being in the world with others in this sort of constant state of negotiation. So for me, it's never about self-world and the spiritual, the transcendent, and the material. It's always this constant enfolding in, it's convoluted. It's to try and generate a space where it's possible to think about these things in a very enfolded way, rather than being tempted to separate off into a place where you can escape to or from.
Right. But it sounds like correct me if I'm wrong, that you can become quite lost in this process of producing the drawing. How when you're working on a drawing, do you find that? How aware are you of your surroundings?
Yeah, it is a sort of. I'm interested in the idea of how to think about being lost in a way, so that it's not just a falling into oblivion or a giving yourself away, but to think about ways of generating rhythms where you distribute yourself into thinking about world. So it's not. I mean, I'm constantly looking at all sorts of ways of thinking about space and listening constantly to sound. So there's this constant respiration going on, where I'm folding ways of thinking into work and trying to find a way, almost like surfing, of staying upright and negotiating the forces and trying to find a way of unfolding these things into the work without trying to set up a clear statement or to get lost. So.
I'm interested to know, actually, from both of you, how you feel about this notion of abstract drawing, and if you consider your work to be abstract.
Yes, yeah. It's. I mean, probably the simple answer is no. Sorry.
Perhaps you should take those down.
Yeah. On the other hand, the other way of answering it would be to say that my work is informed more than anything else by the history of abstract art, from Malevich through to whatever you might choose. I mean, and there's nothing I enjoy more than going to see an exhibition of Malevich or Mondrian or Pollock or I mean, it's all. Which isn't to say, of course, that I will shun the Matisse show when it comes around. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is that particularly certain types of abstract art have, in a way, offered a space to really explore colour as a subject, in a way that if you're doing chiaroscuro and you're doing perspective and such like, it's always going to diminish the colour, and what I'm always looking for is a way of working where the colour becomes the focus and the centre of the work. So I'm always bound to look towards the traditions of 20th and 21st century abstraction in order to be informed and to find some space.
Yeah, well, for me, again, I mean, the word abstract is interestingly generative around all of the problems that configure around it. We've said to do with where is abstracted from what, and where to, but I mean, one of the things I think that Richard was talking about when he was making decisions about the show is that he didn't want it to be to do with the external world or the transcendent or these realms. It seems to me to be very much, I mean, they're not grey, but the grey area. That they're all of these spaces that are in incredibly interesting, complex, ramifying ways, opening up ground where all sorts of things are being brought into the plane of the drawing, which are trying to find relation with each other. I've loved all. I look at everything. I mean, one of the artists I really love is Leonardo, and that whole thing of the way he brainstorms and the way he unfurls a lot of information, a lot of virtuals in order to arrive at actuals. And you feel with all of these artists that they're creating a space, an indeterminate space where there are all sorts of possible ways through and out and in, and they're all pretty convoluted and enfolded. So I'm interested. I certainly feel like I belong to that. That middle space.
A slightly different way. I mean, just glancing around the exhibition, it seems to me that almost all the work in the show feels like each work is autonomous in some ways. It's not a sketch of something else. It's not saying look at this bit of the world over here in a way. It's look at what's going on within the picture space, which doesn't mean it's not referring to the world beyond the framing edge. And
I think Richard's phrase was that it should have no apparent external reference. That was your definition for the abstract drawings in the show.
Of course they do, though. in one simple sense, that there's so much of the work refers to Eva Hesse or to some aspects of minimalism or to Malevich. So that is it refers to other work.
But it doesn't. But I suppose the idea of abstraction is that it's set up as an alternative to representation, and immediately, which is similarly problematic a word, because to represent, you have to have some sort of conception of what the world is, and the whole history of art and philosophy has been trying to get a handle on what the world is and where it is and how do we get access to it. And there have been periods where we've had grand narratives around science, where artists have felt that they can set up the conditions to have a very depersonalised, where they're trying to recreate, they're trying to to make something that is what they see, is what they're experiencing, or grand narratives around God, grand narratives around the subject, the self, the interiority, where somewhere there is this true thing that you can get to. So I think this is a movement away from that, and the word abstract, as difficult as complicated as it is in related ways, within that these drawings I think are am I I'm not making sense?
No, I wonder if what you're saying though is that abstraction has to do with getting to the essence of something. So abstraction.
No, you don't talk about philosophers about essence.
No trouble, I'm not interested in essences. It's just, I suppose, again, it's just sort of setting up where things are in response to them. I mean, I think all of these spaces are trying to set up different spaces where you can maybe tune in to different ways in which the world exists. I mean, with my drawings, I try to bring as much visual information into it as possible, so that I'm trying to tune in to as many sorts of ways of thinking about the world and the space as possible. And as fast as I'm doing it, I'm making marks, which in a way are reaching back. It's like it's trying to create almost a feedback loop. I mean, the idea of reception and transmission, it's almost like I'm trying to absolutely close down the gap between both, where you're reaching out to so many ways, trying to make it hybrid and multiple and across the board, the world, rather than to have ideas where there's this quite limited, I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah.
I think it's a very curious, very difficult subject, abstraction, because if you stick up a David Hockney and you stick up a Mondrian and you say which one's abstract, no one's going to get that wrong. It's easy in a way to notice an abstract work and differentiate it from other types of work. But if you then try to find a principle of definition, it gets enormously difficult, and I'd say probably impossible. It's not that the work doesn't refer or represent, which clearly it does. I mean, for Klimt or for Malevich, the work was more that you couldn't refer to or represent the world in the existing forms of figuration. It was a sort of hyper representation in some ways. For Malevich, the fourth dimension or God or whatever, the suprematist universe. I mean, they are about referring to some understanding of a world.
Yeah. I mean, I think almost as if you bring more, as soon as you start ramifying the things that you're bringing together in the drawing, you almost inevitably get abstraction. I think as soon as you get a number of spaces together, then it's abstraction. I mean, if I were to think, right, today I'm going to make a drawing, and I'm going to think about circuitry, and I'm going to think about internet space, and I'm going to think about virus, I'm going to think about weather, I'm going to think about the city lights. I'm going to, elements of the world. They're all elements of the world. But if I try to bring those, and I'm interested in that hybridity. So as soon as you bring many elements, or even more than just as soon as you create a scrambling, and I think that's. I see a lot of scrambling going on here, where spaces are being brought into proximity and new things are emerging. I think the word emerge comes up a lot, when everybody's talking about these things, what emerges. You create the conditions for something and a drawing emerges, and I think it's this constant sort of quest to create the conditions for new things to emerge in interesting ways.
Spoken a little bit about colour, but there's also a fair amount of material experimentation in your works on paper.
That's true. Well, one thing is that colour never comes independent of the material form or surface of one kind or another, whether that's even with light. I often work on gridded or graph paper, which is in part a sort of homage to Eva Hesse, perhaps. But it's also a way of, there's the terror of the blank sheet of paper that a writer has, and I think that artists often have. And the thing about graph paper for me is it's sort of someone's already begun it. It's a ready-made as well, it's not art paper, which all can't work on expensive paper because I can't start. So you keep thinking, oh no, I'm really
ruin the
expensive
paper.
I'm going to ruin the paper. So if you work on a cheap paper, you just get away some of the anxieties that precede getting started. I love working with different materials. The difference between a gouache black and black card, say, or gloss black paint. These things are vast, and there's a tendency to you say black, you mean everything. It's sort of one thing. Well, of course it's not. Different material, different scale, different surface, all will generate different types of effects, and will feel different. So I try to keep as many different materials as it were kind of up in the air at the same time. I also in part, in order not to get too good at doing something, because the last thing you want to be is slick. And I remember seeing a Boetti show at the Whitechapel Gallery 15 years ago now, and particularly his earlier work around Art and Culture. What I really loved about the exhibition was it was like every time Boetti got good at something, he packed it in and started doing something else. And I think that it gave the whole exhibition a sense of liveliness to it, and a sort of like desperation and improvisation too. And I'm not claiming I can do it like Boetti did, but I thought as a principle it was brilliant. So yeah.
Apart from the support for your work, there's apart from the paper, there's also some of the materials are kind of ready-mades as well, like ready-mixed paints or
Always.
Tapes, industrial materials.
Yeah, I tend to get my materials not from art shops. I might do a bit, but not much. So I use household paints, and again, which are kind of ready-mades because you get them ready-mixed. I never mix my own paints. I don't have a palette in the studio, or acrylic sheet which comes in. There's a limited fixed palette, coloured tapes, spray paints, and so on. So for me, the materials are always sort of the everyday life of the city, really. And whether that's in terms of the three-dimensional work or in terms of the work on paper. Yeah.
And Emma, I think you have also experimented with different materials, and I know that you've used nails and certain objects.
And recently as well, because I've been on the move for various reasons, I haven't had my studio, I continue to think about the grey area, but in a different form. And that was the way I did that was I was thinking about the relationship between the real and the virtual, the actual world and the virtual world, and the idea of the screen that separates supposedly separates the one from the other. And I made these little, almost like little creatures. I thought of them as sort of space molecules or spatial tumbleweed, because I felt like they could travel or move from place to place. They were nomadic like I was. And I had this metal, which is, again, metal is to do with machines. It's cold, it's hard, it's not to do with touch. So it's always my principle to dismantle, to make something give ground, to find passage between that and something else. So the metal, I had to find passage between the body and the metal. So I worked it, and I just roughed it up and worked it and twisted it and messed around with it. And then I wove them together with little silver beads so that they were almost like edge, like all scientists and models sort of thinking about space to do with ball and lines. So many models built this way. So it was this little molecule that felt very very made. And then I put them on on drawings of like graph drawings. So there was this relationship between the planes, and I photographed it to take it into the photographic realm, and then I put that onto the screen of the computer, and then I put the screen of the computer horizontal, and I put the creatures on their own images, and the images were taken at angles so that there was focus and blur, and there was a sense of terrain, so the image was at an angle, and this was, and I photographed it again and again and again, with all of these to really complexify the space of where was this strange middle ground between the real and the world, but it was just constantly ramifying and complexifying. So that was a recent thing.
That sounds like there's a fair amount of technical innovation there as well. But do you tend to do you also push the you've spoken about carbon as being a sort of your primary material. Do you tend to test the limits of that?
Oh, completely. I think carbon's a really huge material. I'm very committed to it for a lot of reasons. Materially, it's made of layers that slip easily. So it's a material for palimpsest and for slippage, and for making and unmaking. It sheds its layers, and the layers between each layer it's very tightly bonded, and between the layers it's very loose. So it's receptive to this massive expanse of making mark. So I go from doing the quietest little whispering marks and tapping marks all the way through to putting them in drills and jigsaws and distancing it from my own hand. So, within any one drawing, again, it's not just between the machine and the touch, but actually to have this convolution where I'll set up a very geometric template of repeating marks. I'll mangle it with a drill, with a pencil, and then I'll very, very quietly dance over it with hand-made marks, constantly listening to sound that will disrupt my way of approaching that mark making.
When you say sound, do you mean music?
All sorts of sound, yeah.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
What on?
It varies. I did a series of drawings recently where I was listening for several days to the sound of rainfall in earphones, because I wanted again to shut down the gap between reception and transmission. And that was like, I thought of that as broadband sound, where all the frequencies were existent within that sound space. And I listened to it, and I drew up these sorts of graphs, these columns, and marked them very, very carefully with 2mm gaps all the way through. And then I had a rolling ruler and a mechanical pencil, and I tried to, as closely as possible, respond to the rhythms that were going into my ears with the marks I was making, to try to almost make myself a machine, but to create this sort of strange, again, twilight zone, this white noise visually made. So that. But I also listened to a lot of music, and just ways to think about space and time and mark making.
Is there any sound element in your work? Is
Yeah,
the studio quiet?
I listen to country music all the time. I do. I always listen to music, because I try listening to Radio 4 and then I get really angry. Because there's a certain, you listen to quite a good program and then you realise you're onto Gardener's Question Time. What am I doing? So, music, and I think, what's this doing to my brain? There's all this information about
country and western.
Sorry. Yeah, well, we're going to fall out at some point. I do like listening to music though, but actually even then, even when you can, changing a CD or an album every hour, actually that's often too disruptive. It's too short a time. And I can't listen to classical music when I'm making work, because you have to work to listen to it, and I just don't hear it. So I need pop music I listen to.
That's interesting, because you mentioned the city a couple of times, and can you hear the city as well?
Well, a couple of weeks ago I could hear the rainfall for about the last year. I didn't need to put headphones on for that.
We could all hear rainfall.
I have big windows in my studio now, and I really love seeing the world outside. Because often studios are more like this, where you might be top lit, but you don't see the street. And I really love having the street there. And it's not a direct reference, but it's in your visual field,
Anna mentioned Peter Halley earlier, and I went to his studio last year, and I was really struck by when you look out the window, there's almost a formal relationship there, just in the architecture that you see out the window of the studio to the paintings as well. I mean, it's a studio you've been in for, I don't know, 20 more years. Yeah. It's strange. I think I wonder how much this, what's on the periphery of the studio enters into the work.
Yeah, very much so for me. I mean, well, I was saying to you just before we were talking here that I had to move out of my last studio, because as I've been saying, I'm very, sound is really, really important to me, and I've become very sensitized to it. And I've listened to soundscapes, which are this particular artist, Francisco Lopez, who has made this fantastic, he makes field recordings out of everything. But one of the ones things he made was buildings of New York, which is made up of all of the sounds that buildings make, including vents and generators and just the hum and buzz and creak. And it's beautiful, and he's done beautiful things to make it. And I can listen to that and I can work to it. But in my studio, I had this neighbouring building that had a vent that went, and I had to leave, because I couldn't. I even sat there and thought, try and change your relationship with the sound. Try not to be oppressed by it. That's just your approach. It's not noise if you open your heart to it. So I actually sat down and tried to do a drawing to it, and there was something about it. It was just like this dead sonic blanket, and I just couldn't do anything with it. So that drove me out of my last studio. Yeah. The place before that, they had trains and everything going by, and I loved it there. Yeah.
I wonder if there's something almost antithetical in the meeting of the process of drawing with the notion of abstraction.
I don't know. You'd have to offer me a bit more.
Well, okay, if we think about the other words that belong to the group of, the other words that one might use for a drawing, such as a sketch, a diagram, an illustration, it's something that perhaps
those other words all presuppose some referring to something else. A sketch for it, you would say it's an illustration for this, or an illustration of this, or a sketch for that. It would propose a relationship with another work beyond it. The term drawing itself, in a way, doesn't quite do that. I think it's probably why. Weirdly, actually, a lot of what I call drawings aren't actually drawings. They're spray paint and collage. But I still think of them as drawings. I think they have the.
So they're not drawings and they're not abstraction.
Yeah, but I'm very happy to be in the show. Seriously, it's a fantastic exhibition, and I am genuinely delighted. Well, yeah, no, it's work on paper. That we can agree on, more or less, most of the work. It's strange because it's probably quite a lot of works in the show not drawings. They're not drawn in the sense that they're handmade. David Austin's look suspiciously like paintings to me.
He's here to defend them.
And Anisha's, likewise. But I still think they belong together as a group.
I think your work's definitely drawing.
Yeah.
Yeah. For me, drawing is an ongoing activity. It's not a preparation for anything, and nor is it an end in itself. It's a constant. It's constantly moving. So just as much as any particular drawing is a grey area, is a space, it's just one in an endless series. I'm always drawing on all scales and thinking about. So for me, it's very much about. It's performative. It's about moving. It's about exploring. It's about reaching out. It's like I feel like I'm reaching out to the world and also creating the conditions for the world to reach me. It's like building pathways, So a little bit like lightning, where the tree lets off the streamer and then the electricity, which is elsewhere, they meet. It's like you're creating the conditions for something to meet. It's sort of synaptic. It's about passage and it's about flow and it's about creating the conditions for flow. So I was interested in Richard setting up this thing of reception and transmission. And for me, like even if you look at the structures that are built directly to do with transmission and reception, like sound, those sound mirrors or radio towers. I love all of those structures, but they are built in order to transmit and receive particular information. And I suppose with my drawings, I'm trying to make things that can listen to almost anything. It's like space encounter, third encounters. What's that? I've forgotten what it's called.
Close
Encounters of the Third Kind, where they woo, 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 and then they answer back. It's like you're trying to sort of set up some sort of possibly reciprocal relationship between self and others and world, and get as much information as you can to do that.
I think something else that the work feels like it has in common, and a lot of work on paper and a lot of drawing type work feels like it's a sense of being quite provisional. it's not fixed or finished. It's always proposing another possibility. And I think one of the reasons that I always love looking at drawing exhibitions, or it's as if because it has that sense of that sort of provisional feel to it, and it's almost like it's not quite like looking over the artist's shoulder and getting some sort of privileged access, but it's always open. I think it feels open, and that you can participate in it somehow. One of the reasons I never make the sculptures that my drawings propose is because I think they would be terrible. In a sense, and and if you realised it in a particular material, that would sort of finish it, and by finishing it, you would kill it. In some ways.
Well, the word define is to kill, to bring to an end. So it's the sort of opposite of definition.
Is there a relationship between the drawings and the sculpture, or they sit completely independently?
There is a relationship, and I think they're parallel to one another, and they're in conversation with one another. But the drawings are not subsidiary to the three-dimensional work, and they're not plans for it. But I used to make drawings a long time ago in order to figure out certain constructions I wanted to build. I'd do endless drawings, and then I'd get one and I'd make it. Then, for various reasons, I started working with ready-made materials, which is very close to starting to work with colour. And I realised there was no space in that activity for drawing. There was no need to I couldn't make a drawing of a light box. It wasn't going to help, or an industrial dolly. It was about responding to the ready-made objects in the world. And it made me think, well, that's a shame. I probably won't do any more drawing now, there's a relatively quick form of gratification in drawing. I like doing drawing. And I assumed that would be it. And what I found was that the drawings continued, but they just continued as an independent activity related to, but not subsidiary to the three-dimensional work. And for a long time I didn't show them. I thought I just wanted to keep them as sort of studio reflections. And I thought to show them would make me self-conscious about them in ways that I didn't want to be, but I got over it. Eventually.
I know your work, although maybe there's not so much diversity in forms of media, but there is an interdisciplinary background to it, I think. And I know that you studied philosophy and literature, and that informs the work in itself. Perhaps you can tell me a little bit more about that.
I continue to read, but I don't. It's again convoluted. It's still an unfolding. I feel like I learn from everything. I feel like I learn from music as much as I learn from philosophy or from literature or from people, from anything. You're always learning, and my drawing is a way of being present to that learning and processing it, and and as I say, just this constant sort of feeding back. So I don't separate. Don't separate out any of these activities. It's all just collapsing down into the whole thing. But I think a lot about, because rhythm's so central for me. Thinking about rhythming material. Listening to music. You listen to something like 18 Musicians by Reich, and you're hearing about repetitions, and you're thinking about accumulations, you're thinking about patterns, you're thinking about emergent structures. You listen to hip-hop, and you're listening to nested information, sampling that's been brought together, and ways in which flow is being considered, where these very sort of disparate items can be brought together sonically and made to work. Where you read Tarkovsky talking about filmmaking, sculpting in time. He talks about editing. He talks about a particular a section of film which has its own time. He describes it as having its own time, and that then there's this challenge in the process of editing, where he has to work out how to get these pieces of film that have their own time to come together and to flow. And it's not to do with narrative; it's to do with rhythm. It's to do with ways of thinking about space and time, and history and past, present, and future. And I'm interested in all of these things and trying to find ways of thinking about them. So, yeah.
I can't remember if we're having if we're opening it up to questions now. Or...
If there's any questions now. Actually, a question for you, Emma, but just before that, if you could just, we're just going to bring the microphone towards you. Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment first to David Batchelor in terms of spaces that I just think it's really lovely to come back here, and I was at your the last time you came and spoke, and to see the work that's next to yours, quite like the drawing that you were speaking about Eva Hess last time, the grid, the little circles, which was the first piece I saw of Eva Hess stuff, and so I just thought that was a lovely Emma, you partly answered this. I've got two very good questions. One is, you talk about philosophers, you mentioned being in the world of others, so obviously Merleau-Ponty, but I wondered if there were any other writings, Tarkovsky obviously, but or any other philosophers that you think are pertinent to your work or really stand out. And the second thing was, if you're constantly trying to keep the space open, how do you know when a piece of work is?
Okay.
I think you partly answered that in terms of talking about the concept.
There are a lot of thinkers. I really love Dolores. I'm really interested in Dolores. I love Derrida. I leap into my Batchelor. I read a lot all over the shop, but those are the ones that come immediately to mind. In terms of a drawing being finished, I think it's almost like it comes to a resting place, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's a harmonious or peaceful resting place, but that you set up rhythms. I throw out rhythms and create the conditions to be constantly responding within my own drawing. And I can start with something extremely violent and then respond to that violence, to try to hold it or settle it, or to do something that's rhythmically responding to it. And I'll keep on working until it seems to come to a rest. It stops feeling like it's just turbulent and destabilized. So even if at the end it still feels violent, it still has come to some sort of almost like a strange attractor, in that sort of where something has its signature, it just comes to its own piece. I mean, you look at some, I won't start talking about it, yeah.
I've got a question for Emma. You talked about transmission and reception, and these are two terms I've been very interested in thinking about solid wit. You talked about transmitting an idea to the viewer via his drawings. And I noticed on the artist selection of books in the library here, Shannon Weaver's Mathematical Theory of Communication. I'm not sure if you or Richard or who else might have selected that. But in that text, of course, in addition to the transmitter and the receiver, another key term is noise.
Yeah,
and
that's really important for me.
Just wondering if you could talk a bit more about how that might feature in your discussion of transmission and reception.
Yeah, I'm very interested in noise. I mean, that's again why I was talking about the rainfall, because it's broadband, it's broadband sound, and it suggests, and again, it's about a zone of potential transformation. And the signal-noise relation. I mean, all of our ways of being in the world are to do with setting up figure and ground. The question of focus is about, it's a violence at the heart of being human, that immediately you focus in order to, you make a decision about what's important and you exclude what is unimportant. And in order, we set up terrain in order to function, we set up rules in order to make progress. All of our ways of talking about operating successfully as human beings involves sort of a violence, setting up conditions, and things need to be outside those spaces in order for them to work effectively. The abject, the other, the everything, you know, that contaminates or disrupts ease of functioning. And I'm very interested, I think noise is a very political and very generative idea, because it's about scrambling, it's about retuning, detuning, opening things up, trying to make something that you might describe as a blurred space, where you have a capacity to not necessarily focus, but to be able to have more of a broadband attention and to create the conditions to take in more information than that and transmit more information than that. And to have a greater capacity for difference and for other and for the plural and for the multiple and for the hybrid. And that, I think that's quite a need, an urgent need in all sorts of ways.
So when you're listening to rainfall, is that the signal you're trying to transmit via drawing, or is it the noise that is interfering with what you're drawing, or is it kind of not as simple as either of those things?
It's a very strange experience to do that. I found it both it made everything go strange. It made time go strange, because I was being so present. I was being so focused on breaking down this thing of noise and making and attending and being present that time sort of became lost while I was making it, and at points in a very joyful way and then in an oppressive way. It made me very sensitized, but I did feel like I sort of definitely achieved this, a blurring of all sorts of boundaries. That was very interesting. Yeah, anyway, yeah.
Just to continue on what you were saying, you talk a lot about what is in your mind and what you hear and visually what you see, but what's your body like? How does your
Well, physicality is really important for me as well, because again, it's another sort of separation that I constantly want to disrupt, you know, and I think one of the things that music helps you to do is to disrupt your physicality and your way of making mark. And I have and again, you know, as I've said, I've used drills, I've used hammers, I've used very, very cool clinical ways of making marks, like rulers and also sweeps. I've had paper on the floor, just had pigment around, I've been literally dancing on it, drumming and just to try and find ways of physically processing information and transmitting information and enfolding that into the process of making as well. So, I'm really trying to throw out the drawings to as many sorts of different ways of, you know, physicality, music, notation, language, breaking down gaps between writing and mark makings, inscriptions and code and data and virus. And I'm trying to think of as much as possible to make some really multiple spaces, but that are very much about touch and body as well, you know, all of that.
Yeah, but I think kind of more about if you put on all these rules like for rainfall, you want it to really connect.
Yeah.
You want it to be as precise as possible. Were you putting stress in what you feel, or
No,
it
it felt quite relaxed actually. There was a set sort of submission to that process, because it was so, and also it was so minute. I had a very fine lead and a ruler, and each of the columns were only a few centimetres across. So I was like this, you know. In that case, was very, very focused, and I was relinquishing to the rules that I'd set myself, to the sound, so it was the parameters were tight, but the experience was broad. Yeah, it was interesting.
There's a question on the front room.
Emma, I've got sort of one question and one thing to just throw up. Your bad choice of words, maybe. Your drawing is quite large. I think you touched on before that you have it on the floor, on the wall, and so on. Orientation, how does that play for you in your drawings?
Yeah, I feel, again, that's something I'm trying to disrupt. You know, background, again, layerings. I've done layerings, I've done carbon paper as well. I've pierced things, I've, drilled hole things, dropped them. You know, I've had it vertical and horizontal. Recently, I've been twisting and turning it. So it's a constant interrogation. So I just feel like I'm starting, but it's as much as any other component of this. It's up for interrogation. You know, and to be disrupted and complexified, and I want to do that, and I want to take it off the plane of the paper altogether into into other surfaces, and you know, I have a lot of things I'd like to try and do, but it feels like a pretty endless sort of process. Yeah.
Okay. And the other one, which is to both of you, the role of the frame. Many works here are framed. Yours isn't. Yours are. Do you?
I mean, I in the last, when I usually exhibit my drawings, I don't frame them, I just pin them to the wall. Partly because that's essentially how they are in the studio, and it preserves, you know, framing obviously formalizes things, and it smarts them up a bit too sometimes. But I decided I was going to pin these to the wall, I actually decided to get the frame for reasons I can't now remember. But I like works when they're pinned to the wall.
Do they have a budget for frames?
They have a budget for that. I don't think so. I don't think that was, but yeah, so it's a trick. I mean, framing's horrible. I'm never quite convinced I've got. Sometimes you have to get works framed, you know, practical reasons, and I'm not often that happy with them in the end.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because I mean, there's a framing. A framing does all sorts of things that you wouldn't necessarily want it to do. It puts glass in front of it. So an area, for example, that's large and black, like that drawing would become reflective if there was glass in front of it. And the materiality, you'd be distanced from the materiality of it. And also all the ways in which you can respond to the paper, to the immediacy of it, the fragility of it, the matter of it. And that's something I like to be close to. And also, obviously, putting a line around something separates it, encloses it, makes it an object, makes it a point. So in general, I think I would prefer for them not to be, and for there to be this sort of constant sense of series and continuum, and for it to be ongoing. But partly I also do like the distancing, actually, when I've made something, for it to be taken away and for it to be another thing, you know, and I do enjoy that as well, yeah.
Do you have a question? Yeah.
I'd just like to sort of push David a little bit further to be inclusive in an exhibition of abstraction by asking him to refer to his photographs, which are touchstones of photography in the exhibition a little bit. I'm just going to tell that the photograph over there, inclusive of Roger Ackley, pieces actually by Richard Knowles, which I think that in terms of your photographs, they often seem, especially the photography of the white blank spaces of the urban environment, to really be photographs of abstraction in a way, because a lot of them are actually a painted surface, or they've been painted out perhaps. So there is an element of abstraction which you come to through your photography. I just wonder whether you could say that.
No, you're quite right. I mean, I've done a rather long series of photographs of just photographing blank rectangular white panels that I find in the city. So they're ready-mades. Yes. They've found things in the same way that the materials I work with in the three-dimensional work are ready-mades. And they are about abstraction. But you know, I think all my work is about abstraction. It's not quite the same as saying it is abstract. The photographs refer to the monochrome, and you know, as from Rodchenko through to Robert Ryman, through to Oiticica, through to wherever Gerhard Richter, wherever it goes. And I was curious. My photographs refer to painting. My paintings tend to refer to sculpture. The drawings refer to sculpture, and the sculptures refer to painting. So it's they seem to converse across media a bit, and these are photographs of potential paintings, and they all actually came about by. I was told that I went to a lecture that Jeff Wall gave about abstraction actually, and on Kawara's work, and Jeff Wall said that the tradition of abstraction which leads to the monochrome is about turning away from the city, turning away from everyday life. That was the job of painting in modern life. Abstraction was about, anyway, closing the door and looking elsewhere. And I thought, yeah, it's a good argument, I just don't buy it. And I actually set out to prove Jeff Wall wrong by finding abstract art in the city and saying, look, see, it's not. But I think in a way, one of the things that really compels me about abstract art is that it is a way of understanding our relationship with the built environment, be that monochrome painting or whatever. And it's not about depicting the built environment, but I think it is about reflecting on the spaces and the volumes and the surfaces that are unique to the city. So yeah.
I started wondering if, I think you kind of touched on it, it's like when you listen to the sound and the marking, they're almost like, whether it also becomes almost like a space and placemaking for you, and whether also you tend to find, I'm not sure, like in a way archetypal sounds or gestures within, because you've kind of got such a broad repertoire now, and like a relationship with it, you kind of almost develop the spatial language in your practice in a sense that you're familiar with, and whether it does find itself in ways that's archetypal generic.
The space and place and listening is sort of true. It's difficult to talk about that though. I think it's almost like I find myself sometimes sort of thinking about things almost like the songline or the dreaming drawing paintings, or that somehow it's incantatory, that you're trying to bring spaces into existence, that that self and world is mutually arising, and through the listening and the drawing and everything that I'm bringing to the piece of work, I'm bringing new place and new space into existence. But one that's made from all of these things that are being channeled through, and that then the space and the place I make is part of this constant reaching and unfurling and exploring and making of space and place. But yeah, it almost feels incantatory sometimes, or like it's being rhythm drummed up, but that it's drummed up through rhythm and mark and divisions and dividings, but that what emerges is a space. It's a thing. It's contingent, but it's real. It's particular, but it's still real. And I'm interested in that contingence and the particularity of that, but the realness of it as well. It's constantly continuing. Archetypal.
Maybe also archetypal in the sense that the sound and frequency travel within that.
Say more.
Like you're just speaking of rhythm and sound in terms of a way or space has the.
Yeah, it's oscillatory. Yeah.
Way, so then this frequency is supposed to sound, or whatever this other thing.
Yeah.
So just within that, whether there are any patterns there.
I think that there are so many things that are both encouraging and interrupting that process that it falls. I mean, I think that there are certain ideas, aren't there, that when you're not in relation to the external world, that almost when the eyes are looking at themselves, that certain sorts of things can be basic visual information. Have you read anything about that? These sorts of like spirals and specks and certain sorts of patternings that are some sort of basic thing, and they apparently could be seen in very early prehistoric art. And, yeah, but with what I make, I have so many elements that are constantly coming in and breaking it up that it doesn't fall into anything for long, really. It's constantly disrupted. Yeah.
Or even like the R-E or U, it's like they're all the vowels that we all have within us as beings, and in all the languages, to express ourselves through.
Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of setting up. Yeah, I mean, you're trying to sort of set. Yeah, I mean, that's that. I mean, going back to the question of when a drawing is finished, that for whatever reason, I'm making decisions about it being finished, and that it's a vibratory field that, on some sort of level, is working. Functions is working, and that I'm probably going on. It goes off into an area that's difficult to talk about, isn't it? Yeah.
Do you think space is abstract or
It doesn't, I can't, it short circuits me to sort of frame it in those terms. I think it's both and everything and all, you know, it's just, you know, I just sort of feel like these things are just ways of sort of setting out the terrain. But, I mean, like I said about talking about a drawing that I've made, I mean, it's concrete in there, it's made, it's a fact. It's not an airy thing, it's a made thing out of carbon, out of my, you know, it's an actual thing, it's a fact. But it's been made out of all sorts of ways of thinking about space, all sorts of abstract ways of thinking about space, and also very, you know, very particular and present, and, you know, all sorts of like vague mark makings or whatever, but all of these things together to make this very factual thing at the end of it. And that factual thing is important.
Space is an emergent form.
Yeah, I think it is. It is. And we have any space that we inhabit has come about for reasons of being, you know, being in the world, and that space. I mean, there are reasons for it, and all through the history of art, we've been trying to think about ways of opening up different sorts of spaces, and that's why it's so important to constantly disrupt and break down in order to open up the twilight zone to generate new spaces, emergent spaces, more complicated spaces, you know, spaces where more sorts of things can go on, and, you know, and we're open to, yeah, it's just this keeping it vital and energized and moving, and, you know, I think it's a political thing. I mean, even think the whole idea of the prefigurative space, the Occupy movement, of opening up a space which is not about function, you know, that constant question that was asked is, well, what's your manifesto? What are you trying to do here? And the point was, we're not, you know, we're opening up space in order for people to congregate and to create the conditions for something else to occur. And that's an important thing to do right across the board, really, I think.
So we've established that both David and Emma's drawings aren't abstract, which seems like a good point. Thank you.